Yes, hello. Welcome to today's webinar, 6 Fundamentals of Success, Create a Culture of Results in 2017. My name is Daniel Dipple of Passageways, and we are honored to have Stuart R. Levine here today with us. So a little housekeeping before we begin. We'll be sending to all of you a copy of today's presentation and a link to the recorded webinar, so no worries there. Also, we'll be having a few polls during the webinar, so those results also will be in the presentation that you will receive. And also, if you do have any questions, please, in the box on the right, you'll see there within the interface for GoToMeeting, you'll see the ability to type in questions. If you could feel free to just go ahead and do that, and we'll address this at the end during a Q&A session. And last, at the very end, there will be a short survey, so when the webinar is completed and you're exiting the presentation, really appreciate if you spend a few minutes to fill that out for us. So I think we've got a good critical mass of people here today, which is great to see. And I'd like to just take a moment here before we begin to briefly introduce Stuart R. Levine. Stuart has been chairman and CEO for the past 20+ years of Stuart, Levine & Associates, a management consulting firm for governance, strategic thinking and implementation, and leadership development. And EduLeader, an online digital learning company which helps individuals and organizations to achieve success. I'll be speaking a little bit about that later today. And he's also served, and still does serve, on a multitude of boards. And last but certainly not least, Stuart is an accomplished best-selling author of 3 leadership books with over 1.2 million copies in print, including 6 Fundamentals of Success, which was a Wall Street Journal business bestseller. So with that being a perfect segue, I hand it over to Stuart.
Well, thank you, Daniel, and on behalf of Passageways and Stuart Levine and Associates, let me welcome all of our participants today. And up front, Daniel, let's just establish, I'll call it, some objectives that we have for our conversation today. One, what we want to do is lay out some very practical and grounded perspectives so that all the participants will walk away with a couple of ideas on improving their own, I'll call it, productivity, their own ability to navigate a very interesting and challenging world, to do it with some degree of clarity and energy, and ultimately to be able to pivot, whether it's in a corporation, a healthcare system, a bank, and pivot into the world that is coming at us with increasing velocity. We're looking at a workforce today that has now got 75.4 million millennials, about 40% of the workforce, and that's creating, as we go around in our practice, a lot of conversation about managing those relationships and still getting results. And so what always strikes us is the notion of how do we learn as fast as the world is changing. And I would just say that for those of you who have taken an hour of your time today, we feel a serious obligation to give you some thoughts on how to do that. But the fact that you hit the pause button and really look for some content is indicative of the fact that that's what really smart leaders do. The next page has a graph on it that basically comes from Tom Friedman's most current book, and talking about humanity's adaptability and learning. And what I draw your attention to is the line that's entitled technology, because as you can see, human adaptability has now been fundamentally stripped by the increasing velocity of technology. I would say a couple of years ago we were working out in Silicon Valley for Juniper Networks, and what struck me one day as I was in one of the labs, I really got an insight into what I'll call artificial intelligence. And so here we are in the human experience trying to learn faster, govern smarter, and ultimately take that technological advance and push it up against our system. So what does that look like in practical terms? Literally, last night I was working with a client of ours, CEO of a large healthcare system, and we were talking about developing a new welcome portal. And so if you think about it, as we were last evening, you know, the old model, the linear world, said we'd have to have somebody at the front door of the healthcare system, the hospital, greeting families and patients as they came in and move them through the system. Today, the relationship, and I'll call it the ability to own that patient's life and their family, starts with a welcoming portal, a big pivot and a big change. So the next slide is kind of a very interesting one to me because it's an African proverb. We do some work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and they have this in a very prominent, this saying, this proverb, in a very prominent place. And I think it speaks to the issue of if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. And I think it sets up the basis for some of our conversation today, which is around collaboration, which implies sharing information and also how you develop much more agile cultures that are focused and get results. And as Daniel pointed out, we're going to have poll questions throughout our conversation today. And the first poll question is, do you know what's on your boss's dashboard? Yes, somewhat. No, never thought about it. And it might sound like a counterintuitive, and I'd ask you to just spend a second and punch in your response. And this becomes an important conversation because sometimes, for those of us in leadership and management, we think that everybody understands what's on our dashboard. And so it'd be very interesting to see how people respond to that. Daniel, what do you think we're going to hear from our participants?
I think if we had an open forum, we'd hear a lot from people about what is a dashboard. I think it means different things to different people. So I think from that perspective, it'll be interesting to see the responses.
Sure. Okay. So let's see. So basically, only 29% of the people said they knew what was on their dashboard. 51% said somewhat. Now that's really interesting because what you see when you work in organizations is people working really hard. And if you can visualize my left and right hand moving in different ways, people working hard but not necessarily aligned to what is on their boss's dashboard. And I guess the most common sense way I can define that for you, Daniel, is if you get into your automobile this evening to go home, you have different gauges, the odometer, the speed, and so forth. And those things kind of tell us how fast we're going, how much fuel we have. And it's the same thing, I will call it, in leadership. We have to be clear to say to people, hey, look, these are the important metrics that we will hold you accountable for. And I literally was working with a very senior person about a week ago, and I said to her, you know, by the way, have you been clear on your dashboard? And she kind of looked at me, not too dissimilar to your response, and fundamentally, that was the beginning of that cultural pivot to make sure that everybody understands it. So in healthcare, you know, based on the conversation last evening, it's the patient outcomes, it's the employee health, their wellness, the financial performance. In a credit union, excuse me, it's the member satisfaction. In a bank, it's looking at employee satisfaction and things like that. Many of these discussions about bosses' dashboards require a conversation. And I think where people get in trouble is they're assuming they know what's on their boss's dashboard. So a clarifying discussion about those objectives starts to get us into, I'll call a more common sense approach. So fundamental one, part of the content, and as we go through the book content, make sure you add value. And you see on your screen, developing your financial IQ, creating your own performance dashboard, but based on how it comes off what I would call the mothership, the boss's dashboard, to get clarification. And creating a plan, because if you don't have a plan, then your results become random and you get pretty frustrated. And the plan denotes, in our world, incredible communication. And I'll give you a sense of what this looks like. So when you talk about make sure you add value, frequently people will come to us and say, I'd like to join your firm. And recently I was interviewing somebody and I said, look, I only have two questions. How are you going to add value to our clients, and how are you going to add value to our firm? And the person looked at me and he was stunned. And I said, no, that's not a trick question. I'm just interested to see how you can add value to our clients and our firm, because I wanted to see the depth of that individual's thinking on how that person was going to add value to the two core constituencies in my professional life. So when we talk about making sure you add value, it's, again, assuming responsibility for your thinking and pushing it up against what you believe to be the direction of the organization. And so for me, making sure you add value on slide 1 becomes hugely important. And then getting into something we'll talk about a little later on, do what matters most first. In other words, control your destiny by prioritizing. Many times we get involved in this bumpy world we're all living in, and we lose and we get distracted. So what we're suggesting is do what matters first, because that adds value to your organization, to your own career. The next slide, again, talking about making sure you add value, talks about preparation. And to me, as we continue to have the privilege of working for some really smart people, the notion of preparation, so for those of you who are on with us today who serve on boards of directors, we know that obligation about preparation, which means you go to a board meeting, you are prepared because you've read the board book. For those of us who are working with teams of people, it means going into the conversation not just to participate in, I will call, a random act of drama, but in a focused conversation. And I'm thinking specifically about one of our clients who we were advising very recently, and I said to her, look, when you go into that meeting, forgetting reading them the Constitution of the United States, specificity around the 2 or 3 questions you need to be answered in the context of that meeting, and then kind of participate in the conversations. So asking the right questions denotes preparations, and that pulls you out of, I'll call it, that drama cycle that kills us all. The burn rate of key resources, again, when you look at business and life, there are 2 resources. You have financial and human capital. And I think sometimes we get lost in just coming into meetings and thinking about this is just a common sense approach. I would differ. We have some data that I'll share with you very rapidly, but on productivity. So as an example, 40% of a manager's time is spent in meetings. So think about your life, and if you're wondering why some days you go home with incredible fatigue, 40% of your time is in meetings. Only 28% are considered, and as well, 28% are considered unnecessary. So 40% of your time is in meetings, 28% are unnecessary, and then you ask the next question, are the meetings time-consuming and do they hit your objective? 39% say that they hit their objectives. So that gives you a basis when we talk about productivity and taking control of your life, making sure that you can add value by understanding that maybe sometimes you don't need to be in the meeting, and in fact understand the sanctity of time. Investing in yourself in our world means learning, and so as we see this pivot increasing in velocity, technology, new products, new services, that means staying current. Currency is critical, and you base that on the data that you get, hopefully independent, from the customer, and take the integration of those portals and put them into a consumer reality. So the feedback, again, on a board side, tomorrow I'm in a meeting with a board of a publicly traded corporation where we'll do an assessment of the board, which fundamentally means we just hold up a mirror and we collect data and say, okay, this is what you look like on some days. I have a good hair day, and some days I don't. But at least you get independent feedback, and then you can make your decisions on how you want to move forward. Fundamental 2, communicate up and down and inside and out. And again, in a world that's pretty bumpy out there, people get distracted and they don't necessarily hear. So the most important thing for me is understanding that there is a rhythm, and embedded in establishing that rhythm is developing crisp communication. We're not talking about 300 page reports when I was advising a leader of an academic institution a couple of days ago is make sure that in 3 or 4 sentences you reaffirm what's on your dashboard to the entire faculty and other groups so that those people can align behind your vision and where you're going. And we talk about if it's important to say it twice. So as an example, in healthcare, in a surgical procedure, when they're about to infuse blood, the physicians, the nurses, the other clinicians will reaffirm by saying it twice, O positive blood. That type of redundancy is critical to communication. And if you study patient outcomes, you understand that about 75% of those, I'll call it adverse effects, happen because of communication backgrounds. And then lastly on this slide, stay open to other viewpoints. Again, I gave you the data on the millennials coming into the workforce, and now diversity becomes more, I'll call it commonplace. So staying open to other viewpoints and the way people express them will really determine how successful you will be. On page 2, fundamental 2 rather, we talk about cutting to the chase, and embedded in that is, if you can visualize with me, how many times will people come up to your workstation, your office, and say, by the way, can I have 5 minutes? And that 5 minutes turns into an hour conversation. So for me, if I ask somebody for 5 minutes, that implies that I've taken the responsibility to think through what questions I need to ask and then move on. But cutting to the chase implies clarity in thinking, which again is a differentiator in the fundamentals. And excelling at giving feedback, which I think should be, and the way it looks to me there is, if you're in a meeting and somebody's acting in I'll call it a non-productive way, I think one-on-one we should be able to have any conversation, not necessarily taking somebody out. I'm not a major league proponent of public floggings, but tight in private, I think becomes really important. And then lastly on this page, hostile business environments, changing business environments require much tighter, much clearer communications, and there is no organization that can really succeed today and build into the future, and no human being without having an embrace on communication and regularized communication, and not longer but shorter. And I would just observe that for those of us who go into meetings, that once in a while it's fair to say, is this necessary? Do we need an hour? Or perhaps we should consider something much less. Brings us to poll question number 2. How often do you establish an agenda in advance of the meeting? How often do you establish a meeting in advance? Always, sometimes, never thought about it. And please take a couple of seconds and share with us your thinking on that. Daniel, where do you think our participants are going to come out on that one?
Yeah, I have a quick thought on that. I think it
Sure.
might be known to the person conducting the meeting and have it in their head or possibly written down. But the bigger question, which I think this is getting at, is have they shared it with anyone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really interesting question, I think. So is it possible, Kaneko, to see how people have responded to that question? Here we go. Poll number 2. Okay. So 69% say that people establish an agenda in advance of a meeting. I'd say that's pretty good. But that tells me that when you round it all out, 30% of the meetings we attend, which tracks pretty much to the data I shared with you earlier, are not necessarily understanding why they come into a meeting. And if you're ever looking about how the heck do we get results in our culture, this is an underlier. Because if we come into meetings and we're not sure why we're there, then we have a problem. So understanding, if you have, I'll call it the pen, if you're the person that's leading the conversation, asking a question of yourself, what's the purpose of the meeting? And it requires what you and I would call some discipline in thinking. So that leads us to fundamental number 3, how do you deliver results? And for me, it's about accountability, because without accountability and me embracing that responsibility, excuse me, it's very difficult to move on, okay? So the agenda, which always starts with the mission and the purpose of why we're together. And something that's counterintuitive on delivering results that I've found very helpful in business meetings is we come together, and then at the end we have a punch list in the last 5 minutes of the conversation that say, okay, here's what we're going to do, and by the way, here's what you're going to do, and here's what I'm going to do, so that we have some type of good follow-up to the meetings and continuity. So it's not just a meeting and agenda, but it's also the follow-up. And then ultimately understand that there are risks, because we're making a commitment when we bring people together, and how you deploy those resources and get results. On the next slide, we still talk about delivering results. Excuse me, and this is a really counterintuitive scenario, because if you go to the number of meetings we all do, you can come up on the notion of infusing meetings with energy. And I want to be really upfront with everybody, because sometimes if meetings are not organized properly, you can develop what I will call fatigue in the culture. Fatigue is based on tedium, based on only one or two people talking, based on, I'll call it the D as in Delta, people controlling the agenda. And so infusing meetings with energy means we start on time, we end on time. It means that we get some inclusion in the conversation. And remember always, and it's interesting again as you look around the boardroom table or you look at client meetings, there's only so much oxygen in the room. And if somebody's taking all of the oxygen, I'm not necessarily sure that's the most productive way. So for me, infusing meetings with energy means do not let the D players really control what the heck we're doing, and making sure we're giving people in advance information that will help them think through the conversations. Next slide that talks about conducting yourself and your business with integrity. And again, I think a very practical and common sense approach here is helpful. It's about your brand. You have a brand. I have a brand. Daniel's got one. Passageways has one. And if you think about it, your self-confidence comes from your values. What do you believe in? And surrounding yourself with ethical people, I believe, becomes critical to a successful life. If you surround yourself with people that operate, sometimes the black and the white issues in life are pretty easy. It's the gray ones. People that you know don't share your values. They do not share your ethics. And then those people, frankly, put us into jeopardy. So surrounding yourself with ethical people and conducting yourself with business and integrity becomes hugely important. And you can see the same newspapers I read, the allegations around Wells Fargo, where allegedly in the culture, they set up different sales promotions that had no basis for ethics. And the amount of money that it took and will take for that organization to work its way through litigation, allegations, is really significant. And you don't want to be in an organization and you have a choice of who you associate with. So for me, if I have a choice, I always select people that are ethical, that are willing to be discreet and understand that these opportunities that we've all created are a precious commodity, and you let those people next to you who you trust. But it's about our own brand, and again, based on where we are in the human existence, people can check you out and me out really fast. Brings us to fundamental 5, investing in relationships. And to me, the notion of setting up a relationship radar screen, talking to, again, this healthcare executive last evening, making sure that in his case he shares current thinking about patient outcomes and clinical outcomes with his team. Don't assume that people see and understand. So setting up relationship radar screens means that We're sharing information on a regularized basis that ultimately what comes around does go around, and so periodically in the world order, people do change jobs. They get vocationally disturbed. I had lunch a couple of weeks ago with a friend of mine who was a significant business leader, hit the bump. And guess what? That's where I think we all have to reach out to people that we're friendly with and be available to help those people through those difficult times. This notion is critically important to me, Daniel, and it's about picking your team. And it says in our book, it's 90% of the battle. And I will tell you in about 90 seconds, it works this way. If you visualize A, B, C, D, kind of a pretty fundamental view of the world, A players are full of energy, full of learning, very productive. B are a little bit below them. C kind of just come to work, do their job. And the D people, in some cases, can be ethically challenged. They are the people that say, we can't do this because we tried something 2 years ago. And you make a decision for your team, and I will call it to optimize your opportunity to lean into the future by who you associate with. And if you go through kind of a checklist in your mind of who you're going to associate with, for me, that A, B, C, D in a culture, there is no way you can compete effectively today, get the financial results we're all held accountable for, without really understanding this little grid of A, B, C, D, and that is 90%. That's a big number, 90% of the battle. So for me, I'm always careful, and I'd recommend to you as friends and colleagues that we learn from A players together, and if you hang out with really smart people, you end up having, I'll call it, a much more productive career on a moving forward basis. Next slide. Investing in relationships continued. Recognize the doers, the people that really make things happen. And by the way, it's not always financial. You know, for me, I'm always, I'll call it, encouraging people to, like you're doing right now, put yourself into a learning situation. The doers should be recognized with some regularity, and it doesn't have to be a $10,000 bonus. Sometimes it's just a fast email or a text saying, thank you, I appreciated your contributions in the meeting. That kind of gives people some courage to push on. And seeking out the energy generators, again, is a very conscious decision, not the negative people, but the people that really know how to generate good thinking and clear ideas, and recognizing ultimately at the end of the day that nobody is irreplaceable. And I think for me, it's always given me some perspective. Daniel, let's go to poll number 3. And it says, in a work setting, how comfortable are you with not knowing the answer? And let's put that up on the screen, and the options are very, somewhat, and not comfortable. Daniel, what's your take on what do you think people will say to us?
It's a very interesting question. I imagine many senior individuals in an organization probably don't feel comfortable because it might hint at their lack of preparation or knowledge. And so I myself, I always know what you don't know. And then in a meeting, it's a lot of times other people don't know themselves. So I encourage everyone, we just do a little more study and research and get the right answer.
Well, exactly. And so let's see what people had to say about that response. So in a work setting, how comfortable are you with not knowing? Basically 24%, somewhat 44%, and 32% not comfortable. So that shows kind of a disparity there, Daniel, huh? Because, go ahead.
No, I agree. It's 75% of people is kind of what I thought would be the case. Haven't been in the business world long enough. Nobody likes to have that silence in the room when someone doesn't know the answer.
Right. But if you consider, I'll call it, rapidly emerging, just the conversation on cybersecurity, okay? And so it's the rare occasion when you will go into a room where somebody recognizes the impact that cyber has today on IP, on call it value creation, your ability to deal with customers, members, and so forth. And you ask people, what's your view on cybersecurity? And sometimes you hear a lot of silence. And I would just say that if you really want to move ahead, like we all do, then you have to be able to put your hand up and say, you know what, I'm not exactly comfortable. I'm not sure I understand or have as much information. And honestly, that's the type of conversation I think that strengthens a team and gives people the ability to communicate with each other on a rational basis. So let's go to the next page about perspective, because again, I am for enjoying my life. I think it's hugely important. But I think you have to define what you want and not be defined by others. And frequently you see people get defined by others. And for me, it's setting a clear objective in your mind that says, hey, here's what I want to do, here's where I want to go, and understand that setbacks make you stronger. Because I have experienced them in my own life. You know, I was a New York State Assemblyman when I was 24. I lost re-election. And most people only get terminated by one or two people. I think I got terminated by 23 people in one fell swoop one evening. And so that setback, if you want to define yourself, you go through kind of a discussion with yourself and say, okay, there are controllable and uncontrollable variables. And so setbacks, if you view them honestly with yourself, can make you stronger, and it can help you prepare, I'll call it, for future opportunities when you go forward. And there are times when you need to take a deep breath. For me, gardening has always been something important to me, reading and thinking, because ultimately, if you don't get some oxygen in your brain, it's very difficult, and if you don't have that perspective, to absorb what's going on around you and to contribute, I'll call it, at a high level of performance that we all need to do. So now we're on to poll question number 4. Which fundamental resonates with you most for success in today's complex environment? Adding value, communicate, get results, invest in relationships, integrity, and gaining perspectives. Daniel, as you look at poll number 4, what do you think, and I would say select one, please, but what do you think people are going to share with us?
I got a feeling it's going to weigh a lot towards adding value and getting results, just because, you know, looking at back to business results for our organization.
Mm-hmm. Right. So let's see. Conoco, is it possible to share the results with us? I guess not. Coming up. Okay, cool. So here we are. The most important, 36% add value, 25% communication, getting results 17, relationships 11, and perspective 11. And so adding value and defining it, I think that's a really interesting response. And then having the ability to communicate starts to open up a path toward really being productive and effective. And for me, adding value in the 6 fundamentals on page 3, I just read you, it's really kind of interesting to me. So adding value as part of your daily actions imply that you know how your organization creates value for customers and how you fit in. Again, counterintuitive, but I wonder how many times we sit down with the people we work with every day. The next point is understand how your company spends and makes money. Sometimes we assume it, but we're not exactly sure. Thirdly, focus on things that are important to adding value. Excuse me. That focus is critical. Next one is care passionately about customers. And then continuously improve your skills and find new ways to add values. And I think that skill basis becomes important to the narrative, because sometimes you get well-meaning people that want to bring change but can't effectuate it because they don't have the skills. And we have an obligation to the people that work with us to make sure that they have the skills, they understand how to add value, and they understand, I'll call it, the important ability to communicate. And I would observe in our experience that you can have the greatest vision, but if you don't have a component part of communications to your core constituents, it's very difficult to effectuate change. So let's go to the last slide up on this part of the program, which talks about the 6 fundamentals in improving results and strengthening your culture. And I know, Daniel, people have been sending some questions into you, so I'll turn to you shortly. But number one, getting clarity on your core values to define your priorities and your aspirations implies to me that getting clarity becomes, and core values, the foundation of why you're doing things. And taking time to understand your organization's values, making sure they're clear. I am familiar with a CEO of a large organization that once every 2 weeks meets with every new employee that comes into the organization, and he shares the values, the mission, and the strategies. And interestingly enough, as he told me the story one day, there was a fellow that came in, I'll call it not properly dressed. His pants were down around his knees and so forth. And he didn't get angry at this fellow who came in late, not dressed appropriately. But fundamentally, he went and found out who hired this individual. He went 2 layers above and said, you know what, this is not working for me because you're not living the mission and the values that are very important to me, and your decisions are not so good. So understanding the values and the mission and the strategies, I think, comes to life when leadership people do that. And then strengthening your ability to adapt and be aware of how to implement an action plan. Because if you cannot implement 2 ideas, 1 or 2, 3 ideas that we've discussed today, that's the goal in life. You kind of get better 1% of the time. But strengthening your ability to keep adapting as the world changes and being accountable for results, which again puts you in the driver's seat. If you go back to our conversation earlier in the hour on a dashboard that are clear, that come off your boss's dashboard, then you align against that. That puts you in a really good position and have an honest discussion. Successfully control your destiny means that you can't sit back today. You can't be passive. You have to lean in and pivot into this world and embrace as much as you can, never sacrificing your values. And I think you do put yourself in a good position to have good things happen when you learn and you surround yourself with really good people. So I'm going to hit the pause button there, Daniel, and take some questions that you have, and let's kick it around.
Okay, we have one question here. I'd like to go ahead and jump into this before we get towards the end of the program. So if having the right team is 90% of the battle, what's your advice on how quickly a new CEO should make changes and giving team members an opportunity to adapt to those changes?
Mm-hmm. So I think, number one, I think about an organization that was a manufacturing organization, frankly, and the CEO came in and said, look, we need to take out 25% of the workforce and tell us who should go. And I said, no, that's not going to happen. We'll put together a system that trains and develops the skills of all your senior leadership team based on criteria. And then we'll do some fast training, and within 30 days, those managers will evaluate the people that are in your organization. And so I believe that a process can be effectuated with some degree of speed, but I would also tell you that in the example I'm giving you, the data came back at around 35% of the organization said that they were D players, mediocre for sure. And from a morality point of view, we said, okay, let's give everybody one more chance to come in, and here's what that one more chance looks like. And then at the end of the day, we're not willing to sacrifice our organization for a minority of people that don't want to move ahead. And so when somebody takes over a new responsibility, I believe part of their plan has to be to set criteria for standards to be held accountable and results, recognizing you never want to sacrifice the institution for the D players and sacrifice the institution and your career. So for me, it's a process that comes in with strategy. It's a process that talks about how people have the ability and the capacity to embrace something new and move forward. But that's an important pivot for people. And I'll tell you, I learned that when we took over the Dale Carnegie organization, when I was the CEO, we had some research that showed a certain percentage of our population was not willing to move ahead. And then you have to make the tough decisions about who they are, how do we remediate them, and how do you remediate them recognizing you have limited financial capital, human capital, leadership capital, and those are the, I'll call it difficult decisions. But that decision really in many ways defines your ability to have a productive life in my view and get the results that we're all talking about, Daniel.
Yeah, that's a great answer. A lot of really good points that I myself am going to take home today. Actually, I got a great question here that kind of segues a little bit. When does one know when it's time to move on from an organization, if integrity and ethics are important to yourself but not to the people you work with, and what kind of impact could that have on your career, especially if you have a lot of time invested in that organization?
Okay. Well, number one, this conversation is not being self-righteous. It's being about being righteous, which means you think a lot about it. And let's say the person that asked that question has been in that organization. Sounds like been there for a while, Daniel, right? And so they've invested some time. And I will tell you that each one of us has a brand, and it's associated with some other organization. And at a certain point, if you know in your gut that the organization is, I'll call it, performing in an ethical basis, that the best way I heard it described to me when I wrote one of my books was, how would you feel if the transaction was reported on the front page of the newspaper and your family read that newspaper? And that was, I'll call it, a very clear heads up for me. And so there does come a point where if a person is uncomfortable with what's going on and you do not believe you can remediate that or impact that, then for me, Daniel, you have to make a decision that says, I'm moving on, because while I still have my integrity intact, you can never, it sounds kind of funny, but I like to eat cookies once in a while. And if you break a cookie in half, it's virtually impossible to put that cookie, those two pieces, back together again and have them configured exactly the way the cookie was baked. And once that cookie of trust is broken, once you know there's something going on and you cannot impact it, then you have to make a really tough decision. And in my mind, those decisions in the long run will pay benefits. For me, I never want to participate knowingly in anything that is not, I'll call it, wholesome. That's not to say that in an investment scenario, we don't get involved in business where deals or investments have, what in the banking world they call it, hair on the deal. They're edgy, but you're not jumping into bed with people that you do not believe would be a good thing for your family to see show up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. That's probably the best way. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you always listen to yourself, Daniel, because most people have a pretty good grounding and pretty much know what's right and wrong. And if it's not feeling right at a certain point, you're going to make some tough decisions. So.
I think that's a great analogy or a metaphor for not having a show up on the front page of the newspaper, or now Twitter, things of that nature.
Yeah.
Social media. Got a really good question here, and this probably gets speaking to all boards, and the challenge that it comes to moving people off when they become obstacles for that organization moving forward. Do you have any advice on that?
I think the whole board scenario is really interesting and very fertile. Number one, um, I think the way you move people off or transition them and some of the criteria that are important to me, you could have been a tremendous business leader even 5 years ago, and you're on a board today, but you don't have a working knowledge of cybersecurity. You don't have a working knowledge of, let's call it, current economics and global issues. At a certain point, you render yourself questionable in your productivity. That's why the metaphor we used earlier in the day, and actually I have a meeting tomorrow with a client on the assessment, which it's taking data through an independent survey that says to the independent chair and the independent lead director, whoever that person is, here's the way we rated each other, here's the way the committee structure looks, and when you look in the mirror, you will see data that will say the following. You know, this person is really productive, this one is not as productive, because when you're around the board table, and let's just call it on average there are 9 people, and this could be a family-owned business or it could be a publicly traded corporation, you know who's done their homework, you know who's adding real value by adding intelligent questions. And if that person isn't, it should be picked up in any credible assessment process, and that's where you have to have a really good functional chair of the governance and nominating committee that can look at that data and say, hey, gee whiz, we need to move forward. And but it's through the collection of data. Again, I'm not for public executions. I am for acknowledging people's service. But if the culture of the board is slowed up by people that can't be productive and contribute, then the culture of the organization at large, shareholders, employees, the customers, get impacted negatively. And that's why boards and leadership at that level and the culture they're responsible for, big word, culture, and the results are impacted negatively if you don't make what you and I would call the right decisions.
I absolutely agree. That's some great thoughts there. This was a very interesting question. I think I'll be the last before we do a quick wrap up here.
Sure.
This is a good managing up, managing down question. Is it possible to influence upper management when communication with upper management does not exist?
Yeah, the answer is yes, because I think that, number one, you can impact that, I'll call it, upper management, senior management person, if in fact your team is focused and getting good results, because invariably there are opportunities to share, I'll call it, new product cycle lifetimes, to share new technology, portals and integration and channels so that you can get to better outcomes and share that thinking. And so for me, again, based on what you just touched on lightly, through social media, you know, most organizations today have all kinds of blogs and things like that, and so you have an opportunity to share information of things that are working in your customer relationship or co-production of products and services with the people you serve. So there are times, and smart senior leaders, even though they are maybe in a different city, invariably will reach out. And you will have, again, in a smart culture, opportunities to respond to culture surveys, climate surveys, and again, bring those things to the attention of the senior team, and or even sharing interesting content that they might not have had access to in the past.
Fantastic answer. Real quick, Stuart, before we go, if you could, Conoco, if you could go to the next slide, and appreciate if you could talk to us a little bit about EduLeader and some of the great things you're starting to do there.
Sure. So netting it all out, look, the world is emerging and evolving is a big word for me today. So the way we learn, so you're moving from, I'll call it, a 3-hour class to now modules that take 5 or 6 minutes. And so EduLeader driven by Liz Perlman and Harriet Levine, is a way to leverage the content. I think you heard a little bit of it today in a new online training program portal, and you'll be hearing a lot more about that as we move forward. But again, when you spread your wings and you're a CEO, you need to build the culture where everybody says, okay, we're going to embrace the following behavior about productivity and results, and it's going to look this way in meetings. Invariably, you cannot train, call it 2,000 people, in a linear classroom model, but you sure can through video online learning. And so to me, that's a manifestation of what we're talking about in that program. And there'll be more to say about that in the coming months, Daniel, and thank you.
Fantastic. You could go to the next slide real quick. I'd just like to say a quick few words about Onboard. It's our board meeting software solution, or portal as some call it, here at Passageways. And I hope you don't get mad at me, Stuart, for doing a little bit of copyright infringement here. Borrowed some of your words because they actually do completely resonate with how we feel about what our product can bring to boards at creating a culture of results. And definitely these platforms for creating board books and agendas, and for also allowing for engagement between the directors, so you can get updates of materials anytime, anywhere, on any device, everything from laptops to iPads, Androids, Microsoft Surface tablets, iPhones, Android phones. So basically any device you can view the materials and then do annotations and make notes. And so it can be for all forms of meetings, everything. We have customers using it for their boards, obviously, and committee meetings for boards, and then down through executives, and even some that are using it with companies that they're partnered with. So please do give us a look, and Kanako, if you could go to the last slide there.
And while we're going to the slide, can I just say this about what you do at Passageway, which is very important to me, and I serve on some boards. Getting material in a secure way, because all directors travel so much, getting them in a secure manner that gives me flexibility to travel in a timely way is hugely important. And that's why, in truth, I'm proud to be associated with you guys, Daniel. This is an important product. Thanks.
Yes, really appreciate those kind words, Stuart. All right, so completion of the webinar today, there's going to be a short survey that's going to be coming up. And you'll also see on the slide here the contact information for myself and Stuart. If you do have any further questions, don't be shy or hesitant to reach out to us. We'll be glad to answer those. And we will be pushing out the presentation and the link to the recorded video here shortly within the next day. And hopefully you'll all join us for the next webinar. And I'd like everyone to give a big round of applause. I realize you won't be able to hear them other than mine, for coming out to speak with us today, and we really appreciate all the hard work that you put in, Stuart.
Well, you're very kind, but we're most interested in what people have to say, so if they can take a minute just to give us their response to the work today, that's really helpful and helps us design the next program, Daniel, and thank you, Kanako, for your help.
Yeah, we actually had somebody that typed in the chat, said clap, clap, clap. So we did get one at least by
We got to get our Bitmojis going.
Exactly, exactly. Again, thank you, Stuart, and thank you to everyone for coming out today.
Okay, have a good day.